ambulance service. However, again, this is a very localized question since we do have the service operating out of Middleton, and I have the document in my office that I guess was handed to me by some of the local people who work for the ambulance service, studies that have been done looking at the nature of calls in our area. And one of the areas of concern is the fact of the extremely large number of calls that are requested, again, in that Kingston-Greenwood corridor, where now I suppose we have probably 8,000 to 10,000 people, and the time that it takes to come from Middleton to the Kingston area. And there is certainly the wonderment and the question coming to my office on occasion, especially if people have sensed that there hasn't been a timely response to the service, is there a possibility of a satellite station or some provision, certainly during the working hours, during the daytime period, of having a satellite type of provision made in this area. This is, again, one of the questions that does come my way because you have to come from Middleton, Kingston-Greenwood area, 9 to 12 minute response time back to the hospital. So it is of a major concern to our area, and I'm just wondering if the minister, is aware of this, and especially with the possibility of building a new site, and in fact, will that make any relief in terms of the time response?
Thank you. The Honourable Minister of Health.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And the question raised by the Honourable Member is one which is not unique to his area. I think what we all need to understand is that there is a contract with EHS with respect to the provision of the service, and that contract says that on average, the average time of response should be 9 minutes for every call that is received, and they're required to live up to that contract. Now, that's an average. Sometimes the response time is shorter than that. Sometimes it is longer. Obviously, there is concern when it becomes too long. Having said that, the actual location of a site that houses the ambulances is not as important or significant as the Honourable Member might imagine. Because, and I'll make the offer to the Honourable Member, if he would like to visit the dispatch centre for EHS, then I would be very glad to arrange a visit for him to it, because when he visits that site, what he will see is that there is a very deliberate attempt, not just attempt, a very deliberate action taken on the part of EHS to make sure that when ambulances are called, for instance, if you have an ambulance that's moving in a particular location and it is called to another site, that the other ambulances are redeployed in order to compensate for the loss of that ambulance to be able to provide service for as long as it is tending to the needs of the call. So when you go there, you will see that they're continuously managing the location of these. It reminded me not unlike what an air traffic control center is like, where there's a continuous management and redeployment of these units throughout the province in order to ensure that they have the capacity to meet the 9-minute the 9-minute contractual arrangement. So the actual site of the base is not as significant, well, in terms of the deployment of the ambulances is not significant. What is significant is the dispatch center which, and it's, dispatch is not the right term. The dispatch, okay, the dispatch center that's there is responsible for redeploying the ambulances. I think if the honourable member had the time to visit that site, he would see more clearly what I'm suggesting now. So that, and if it's of value to him, I would be glad to arrange such a visit.
Thank you. The honourable member for Kings West.
Just about a minute or minute and a half left. So very quickly, I'm wondering when the improvements and the restructuring of the ER at the Valley Regional Hospital is looking at getting underway. I know on my last visit there with the Chief of Staff, his concern, Dr. Robertson, about certainly the overflow, the inability to service people with the capabilities that they have. They have a wonderful staff there, but they certainly feel that very often the delivery of the best emergency care perhaps is certainly compromised a little bit. So I'm just wondering again if there is some, timeline relief that can be given us at this time.
Thank you, honourable member. The Minister of Health has approximately 30 seconds to respond.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. That's a tall order for me. My understanding that the facility will be operational in this fiscal year. So you got to back everything up from there, and I can't give you the precise dates of the other things, but the other steps in the process, but that is the objective, is to have it operational in this fiscal year.
Thank you. Time has expired for estimates on the Department of Health. I'll now recognize the Honourable Government House Leader.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, I move that the committee to now rise and report considerable progress.
Chairman, on the Committee of the Whole House on Supply reports.
The committee has met and made considerable progress and begs leave to sit again.
Agreed? Agreed. The Honourable Government House Leader.
Mr. Speaker, please call the order of business public bills for second reading.
Public bills for second reading.
Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 180, the Municipal Government Act.
Bill number 180. The Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, and Municipal Relations.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I will be brief. I'd like to move Bill 180. However, I do have a few brief remarks. This is a very straightforward bill. Halifax Regional Municipality wants to offer some of its residential property owners who have been hit by higher than usual municipal tax bills, relief. HRM can only do this if the legislature amends the Municipal Government Act. I'd like to take this opportunity, first of all, to address issues that arose in Saturday's Halifax Herald. The article, with the help from the member of Timberley Prospect, left the impression that this was a provincial initiative, arbitrarily imposing relief on lucky residents of one municipality, leaving others to fend for themselves. Let there be no doubt that this legislation was introduced at the express request of Halifax Regional Municipality Council. If any of the other 54 councils requested similar legislation, we'd be happy to consider that as well, Mr. Speaker. There's not much to say about the bill. It's about HRM wanting to give a break to its hardest hit municipal taxpayers. HRM Council has determined that it can afford to offer this break, so I would suggest the legislature should not stand in their way. I will be supporting this legislation, and I look forward to comments from other members, Mr. Speaker.
The honourable member for Halifax Atlantic.
Yes, Mr. Speaker. I'm glad of the opportunity to speak to this bill because, to be quite honest, I was surprised to see it come forward. Bill 40 had set itself out as being an attempt to begin to address some of the problems which plague us in the assessment area within this province. And it has taken a 3-year time frame within which to begin this, however. My curiosity is, why does Bill 180, if it is effectively an attempt to remedy a shortfall in number 40, not set out to empower other municipalities to do the same thing as HRM? I cannot understand exactly why this bill would be coming forward solely on the initiative of HRM and why it would not empower other municipalities just as well. It reads in entirely lenient language and refers to a policy which I understand has not been seen in any way, shape, or form by the provincial government. It seems to me that carte blanche is a dangerous precedent to be setting in any such a complex and long-term enterprise as that of property assessments. We're only too well aware that there are difficulties in the property tax assessment in Nova Scotia. We're only too well aware that there are municipalities where the average assessment is not the 7.6%, which has bedeviled the residents of HRM. The average increase of property assessments may be 7.6 in HRM, but in Richmond County, for example, it is, in Stellarton, it's 9.4%. In Lunenburg, it's 19.1%. Chester, 12.4%. Shelburne, 15.3%. These are municipalities in which it would be reasonable to expect there are a number of property owners whose immediate problems are every bit as dire as those in Halifax. So, given that we have so many different, I won't say assaults, but so many different approaches available to deal with this at the moment at the municipal level, I am somewhat surprised. There is the much vaunted property tax rebate program available to any municipality, and there are, of course, options in tinkering with or even possibly reducing tax rates. And we know that averaging is certainly a possibility there. We have several other bills coming to us at the moment, all of which purport to touch on property taxation difficulties, some commercial, but even those have not been specifically unlinked from or uncoupled from the residential issues. We know that the Bill 40 did not address a couple of particular categories of residential properties, and those are multiple unit residentially assessed buildings. Those are condominiums and those are apartment buildings. Two very different sorts of things, both falling under the cap, neither mentioned by name, as far as I can see, except in the unseen policy. And I would like to say, once and for all, that the temporary tax rebate suggested by HRM is a very, very open sort of a terminology to be used. Well, it's 1 year at the moment, but how temporary is the rebate itself? It's maybe a temporary program. Is the rebate also temporary? Is this a question of averaging? One has no idea. And it seems to me, as I would say again, that the precedent of giving carte blanche to fine-tune the assessment system rather than carte blanche to fine-tune the applications of the assessment system is a dangerous one. If, in fact, we're going to do something like this, it should be done for all of the province, all of the municipalities, those suffering now and those which might. So, in closing, I would look forward to moving this to law amendments. Thank you very much.
Recognize the honourable member for Halifax Clayton Park.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. It gives me pleasure to rise and have a chance to address this bill number 180, which is designed to amend the Municipal Government Act to allow HRM to have some greater control over the setting, I gather, or alleviation of some of the tax burden that has fallen to their residents as a result of rising assessments. It definitely does point to the fact that there were shortcomings last year in Bill number 40 that was passed here in the House. And I think it's important to note at this time that with Bill 40, the first thing that I had said when I spoke on it last year was that it didn't cover condominiums, and that in HRM and in the Clayton Park riding, and I know the Citadel riding and some others, there's a great deal, many people who live in condominiums, a great number of those units. And therefore, I felt that it was going to leave a lot of people left out who are suffering from very rapidly rising assessments. And that, in fact, has been the case. And in this last year, when assessments have risen, the government and, in fact, the city councillors as well have heard from many condominium owners and about the problems that they were experiencing where there was no help whatsoever under Bill 40. And I believe that the minister may be looking at making amendments to that, and I hope that they are, to make it somewhat more applicable to all of the property owners in the province. At the same time, the bill, the cap that was set in our bill, was somewhat high, and what HRM councillors have recognized was that they had many people who will meet an income threshold. I guess they'll determine that in policy, but people that they'd like to give more assistance to. And in their deliberations, they talked about those homeowners who had experienced assessment increases above the average being 7.6% this year. So I think their intent is to provide half of that additional lift in assessments, have half of the amount forgiven for those people who qualify if they fall within an income threshold. And I think it's a good thing to do. It will certainly help people here in HRM. What's unusual about it is, though, to go through the efforts of making an amendment and a change like this, going through the legislative process for a single year. I find that kind of strange, Mr. Speaker. And I think that we might question why any legislative change would be done for a single year. It just seems a little bit short-sighted. So perhaps other changes are being planned that will make this redundant, or maybe we'll intend to extend it at some point in time. But I do question that. I think it's very unusual in this House to be looking at a single year for any legislation. And I think we should all be aware of the amount of time and effort and money that goes into preparing legislation and bringing it to this point. So I think there is a question there. But apparently HRM has requested this. Their councillors would like this power. And with that in mind, we are certainly supportive of any measure that will help individual homeowners and condominium owners to be able to afford their taxes and to just have a measure of relief from the rising assessments. Again, last year, we'd spoken against the bill. We felt that Bill 40 was not the right tool, or had not been fine-tuned enough to do the job that was needed. And I think that this has pointed that out, as well as other private members' bills that have come out in the last couple of weeks, one from the NDP benches, and perhaps we'll see others from the government as well. But I think it sort of highlights the fact that there are shortcomings in what was passed last year, and I do believe that we saw those coming, and I think that more time and effort needs to go into fine-tuning what Bill 40 was attempting to do for those areas of the province where really rapidly increasing assessments have been a major problem. And we do fully acknowledge that there are areas that have been very hard hit by this. Certainly, if the average in HRM is 7.6%, we know it's considerably higher in the South End and along areas where there are lake and water frontages. So we know that's particularly true in certain areas. And I think that it is important to note that the HRM councillors have been grappling with the same kind of problem that we here in the legislature have, and that is how to provide some kind of...
Order, please. Honourable Member Halifax Clayton Park is the floor.
I believe the city councillors are dealing with much the same kind of pressure that we ourselves have been experiencing here in the legislature, trying to respond and find a proper avenue and mechanism to help our citizens to be able to afford to stay in their own homes, which is the goal of all of us as representatives. So with that in mind, as I say, I certainly question the idea that it's only for 1 year, and that we may want to see where this is headed in future, but I'm very anxious to see it go to law amendments, and I know that it does have the support of HRM councillors. So I'd like to, with that, conclude my remarks, and we look forward to law amendments. Thank you.
Honourable Member for Timberlea Prospect.
Oh, Mr. Speaker, the minister has urged me to my feet. I urge the member for, not to get too tied up on what's reported in the media, but it's a nice picture. It's a nice picture. It shows off the smile. It points out, however, Nova Scotia backs Metro Tax Relief Plan. Metro Tax Relief Plan. And you know, if the minister wants to see his picture again, as long as I could have it for my display in my office, I'll table this and they can make copies and bring it back to me. But let's clarify a few things here, okay? Bill 40 was not, and to this day is not, perfect. We all know that. And I know the members of this caucus were lobbied personally pretty strongly by me because I had a particular vested interest in one clause in that bill that I felt was extremely important, and we call it the Homestead Clause. And that Homestead Clause was included in that piece of legislation. It was there because it was the right thing to do at that time, and at that time the minister certainly received publicly and privately my commitments and my compliments to the fact that I was proud to see that that was included. So that's very important. So I can hear the members of the third party say, well, it was a bad bill, why did you vote for it? That's the reason why the members of this caucus supported this member, because I said, and they agreed with me at our caucus meetings over the time of looking at that piece of legislation, that clause and its inclusion is important enough to allow Bill 40 to go through the law amendments, to listen to what people have to say. It's not perfect. We know it's not perfect. And we see the example again of a particular clause, a particular thing that was not included, and it was brought to the minister's attention. It was brought to the minister's attention by the members of this caucus again. And the fact that condominiums and multiple rental units were not part of this piece of legislation. Now, when we bring the legislation forward, we don't have a patent on good ideas. We do not have a patent on good ideas. But when the mayor of the HRM comes calling, it's suddenly brought forward by the government. Now, it would seem to me that it could be just as appropriate that the NDP bill could have been called. The NDP bill could have been brought forward to law amendments. The opportunity to discuss, to vote against, or to support particular clauses in the piece of legislation that was brought forward. But that was not the way it's decided to be done. I would like to clarify, and this is an important thing. Let's compliment the influence of the HRM. Let's compliment them. They have shown the initiative. They are aware of the problem, but their problem in the HRM, and heaven forbid I take it back, Mr. Speaker, if we're suddenly going to start talking about the core and the urban area and the suburban area or the rural area, heaven forbid. But let me tell you, where I see assessments going through the roof are in the rural area, the coastal area. And I'm not talking the south end of Halifax here. I'm talking St. Margaret's Bay. I'm talking Terrence Bay. I'm talking coastal communities. Those are important parts of this province. Coastal communities, Cow Bay, I hear the member from Eastern Shore, or Eastern Passage, bring forward at this time. But I'm pointing out that those are areas with the HRM. But you want skyrocketing you want skyrocketing assessments. I want you to know, Mr. Speaker, I will almost guarantee you that Lawrence Mawhinney, the mayor of the town of Lunenburg, will be there at law amendments. Because if the HRM has a problem, they have little or nothing to complain about in some of their average assessment rates as compared to what is happening in the town of, in the municipality of Lunenburg. And I'm sure that members from the South Shore are fully aware of that. The comment that I made in the media was, and it's a comment that I stick with, I urge the other municipalities to come forward, get on board, because if it's good enough for Metro Halifax, surely it's good enough for the rest of this province. You know, and that's the one issue that always, and I know you probably hear it at home in Spring Hill, Mr. Speaker, or maybe the member from Cape Breton, the Lakes, Victoria, the Lakes hears the same thing. When you're saying, it seems Halifax always gets the breaks. Here is Halifax showing the initiative, and perhaps let's call it like it is. They've done their homework in advance. Someone over there at City Hall has said, let's go to the province and let's see if they would consider this particular piece of legislation. But there are other municipal units around this province that perhaps don't have the staff. I'm not saying they don't have the expertise. I know that we have the warden of a previous municipality here who's sitting to my left. I know that they perhaps don't have the staff to be able to look at this sort of legislation, but this is the sort of legislation that would really be an important piece of legislation that should be considered in places like Lunenburg, should be considered in communities such as Badek, should be looked at as along the Bredor Lakes. It should be a piece of legislation that applies to all Nova Scotians and not just the HRM. And that's the flaw that we see at this stage. Yet, the minister's quite correct. The piece of legislation was initiated and brought to the government by the Halifax Regional Municipality. At this time, I believe, yes, I'll have to include that in my comments. You know, the HRM does have the advantage of all the brains and the brain power that comes from Cape Breton and settles in this community. I can tell you that specifically, Mr. Speaker, in the community of Timberley Prospect, I'm proud to say that there are streets after streets where I have many young people from Cape Breton who've moved here to work in Burnside, and that is an unfortunate development, yet it is, after all, something that the HRM has a responsibility to advocate on behalf of their residents. And they've done that. They have done that. There's a short-sighted approach to this piece of legislation. It's a reactive piece of legislation. It's tinkering again with the flaws of Bill 40. I guess the question will be, will we ever get assessments right if we do it in this sort of piecemeal fashion? If we do it, well, this year we're going to add condominiums, and then furthermore we'll look at properties that have lakefront as opposed to oceanfront. I mean, there can be all kinds of technicalities and specialities here. But let's call it like it is. The assessment department in this province is under attack. They're under attack because of the system and how it's based. And I know the member from Dartmouth North and myself, we've met with people in the department before. We've pointed out to them that market value is not the only way to go. And we've told them time after time after time, market value is not the only way to go, unless you happen to be a real estate agent. And then, of course, you're aware of the fact the line they always give to Nova Scotians, well, it's assessed at that value. Can you just imagine what would you do if you sold that piece of property, if you sold that historic home, if you sold that nice little bungalow in St. Margaret's Bay? Are you aware of what you could make? And the response that the member from Dartmouth North gave that day was so appropriate. People don't want to sell their little piece of Nova Scotia heaven. They want to keep it, they want to pass it on to their children or their grandchildren. And I know that people in the assessment office have their hands tied because of how they are looking at real estate market and market value. That's the safe way to do it. It's not risk-taking. It doesn't involve any real outward-looking, trying to find a better way of doing it, because assessments in this province are in a shambles. They're in a shambles. And people are upset with assessments, how they're arrived at, how they're arrived in areas where you begin to look, well, there was a piece of property sold down around the Cove, and because it went for $250,000, my grandfather's home that he's lived in for so many years and made no real improvements to suddenly jumps through the roof. And I should point out that I'm not just talking about coastal communities. I've heard from other people. I've heard from certain members of the media concerned on the fact that their assessment has jumped because there happens to be a real estate connection to every sale that takes place. Now, we can all go online, Mr. Speaker. We can all go online and we can all look at how our neighbors are assessed and for what amounts. And we all know that this system has been flawed. Now we have another addition to what was Bill 40, and it is specifically designed to help out the residents of HRM. I'm sure that members of Law Amendments will have the opportunity to hear from other municipal leaders. Other municipal leaders, I urge them to come forward and say, if this piece of legislation is good enough for the HRM, it's good enough for the rest of this province. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Recognized honourable member for Preston.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. This is an ongoing problem that all municipalities have, is fairness in taxation. And it's too bad that the whole system couldn't be changed to a system where you strictly pay for services. If you get a service, you pay for a service, and it's evenly distributed all over whatever municipality you're talking about. This bill that's been proposed by the Halifax Regional Council, I realize has had a lot of thought by council, and they've identified some problems that they've run into, and hopefully they've thought it out very well. I was very concerned anytime they start chopping taxes off of one area and benefit another area that may have the services. The big problem we have in the rural areas is that it's always a concern in our area we're not getting the services for the tax rate we pay. And they talk about hefty increases here. There was some articles in the Daily News and one thing or another that said that some of the people had a $50,000 a year assessment hike in 1 year. Well, I've got a neighbor that's had 5 years in a row, $50,000 a year. That's $250,000 in 5 years in the assessment hike. And guess what? No more services. Absolutely no more services, nothing. We have no fire hydrants, no sidewalks, we have no curbs, no sewer, no water. I can go on and on with the list. But that person is paying as much tax as someone in the south end of Halifax that has all the services. So I think there's been some efforts made here by government to readjust the assessment system. The municipality, I know when I was a municipal councillor, reduced the tax rate 2 or 3 years in a row to try to address some of these issues. But the problem is, as long as the value in the municipality and other municipalities goes higher and higher because the property values go up, the system that it's rated on, so will the cost of your property taxes. And it's really taking people out of their homes. I've had some tax sales in my area this year. People with $2,000 owing in taxes have lost their lifetime home because they couldn't pay the taxes. And there's no structure in place to save that. That's the thing we should be talking about here. And if someone lives in an area where they have a very expensive home and they can afford to pay the taxes, and again, that's all relative because so many people have situations, when they're working, they may be able to afford to pay the taxes and tax increases. But when they retire, it's a situation where they can't cope with it. And over time, you get major hikes in your assessment, which seem to be going on an ongoing basis. I'm a little bit concerned about this process. It's, as my honourable colleague said, it's only for 1 year, and that's sort of a Band-Aid. We're getting lots and lots of Band-Aids on this on this assessment issue and the taxation issue. In the meantime, we're putting lots of Band-Aids all over the place. The tax rates are still going up, and people are in jeopardy of losing their homes or having to move from their homes to another location. And I think you're going to see a lot of people move outside the regional municipality just to the fringe areas where the taxes are lower and they're actually paying for services they receive. And it's been a big controversy in my area about the tax rate and the taxes we do pay. I know there's some properties there that pay $5,000 or $6,000 a year property taxes, and again, for what? You know, we get some police protection, which is uniform across the municipality. We get garbage collection. We get fire protection, even though in our area fire protection is part volunteer and part paid firemen. You have to pay for the water. And we have to pay for the water. And not only that, we don't have hydrants every place to supply the fire department, so they have to put other equipment in place to compensate for that, reduce response times, and the list goes on and on. So it makes it very, very difficult for people in the rural area to understand why they're paying so much tax for very little service. And then they come along, again, there's no bus service. I mean, the list goes on and on and on. And then we have this marvelous thing called an area rate. So some councillors get carried away with area rates, and all of a sudden the tax rate in the rural area is higher than the downtown core. Higher than the downtown core, so figure that out. And with no services again. So the municipal tax review that the municipality did a couple of years ago was actually instigated by a question I asked in council at the time I was there. I asked why it was that the downtown Halifax is paying 2.2 cents per hundred of assessment for streetlights, with a light on every pole. And in my area, we were paying 4.6 cents for lights here and there at an area rate. So the CEO at the time couldn't answer my question and very quickly changed the topic and got off it. And after that, we initiated a tax review process, which evened out some of the problems, but didn't really address the problem. And it makes it really difficult for people in the rural areas to understand why they're paying such high tax for such little service. And the argument's always been, well, you're more rural, you got to do other things. And every time a new home is built in the rural area, you get a home that attracts $2,000 in taxes, for an example. That's $2,000 pure profit to the municipality, because they don't have to put any water in, no sewer in, they don't have to put any more firemen in place, no more policemen in place. They're not responsible for building the roads. They're not responsible for building the schools or any other service that typically puts your cost of your taxes up. But yet they collect the money and say, well, you know, you guys really are paying your share. I think more than our share. So I think that we really have to look at this whole issue as legislators here in this building to see what kind of a fair taxing process we can put in place so all residents of any municipality pay fair taxes for the services they receive, and that the municipalities can get the money that they need on a fair basis so they can provide the services they do. But there should be a law passed here that you could not charge taxes for service you do not receive, and I believe that's happening right now as we talk in the Halifax Regional Municipality in the rural areas. And if you really broke the tax rate down, which a municipality has not done and won't do unless it's legislated here to make them do that, I think it'd be a very, very interesting conclusions when that came out. And if you look at all the other things, like for instance, in the core here, get crossing guards that the municipality pays for. Excellent, excellent thing. We don't have any of those in rural areas, none. So our tax rate doesn't pay for that. In Halifax or in Dartmouth, they have sidewalk snow removal. They pay an extra fee for it, but that's not something we'll ever have in the rural area. We've got no sidewalks. I think I've got probably about 400 feet of sidewalks in my whole riding. So snow removal and sidewalks isn't really an issue for anyone in my area. I have a small area, they got sewer and water. The only reason they got sewer and water is because the former city of Dartmouth needed the water supply. So the deal was we'll give you water and sewer if we can get the water supply from you. So that's been an issue too. And then they go along and the municipality was charging North Preston, for instance, fire hydrants for fire protection, fire hydrants that don't even meet the standards. They don't even meet the standards. You can't use them to fight a fire. But yet they were paying property taxes on it. So, you know, that shows a lot of the inequity that's going on in the tax rate. I'm going to support this because the municipal council brought it forward, and if it helps alleviate some of these things, that will make it better for taxpayers in the area, and the property taxpayers. It'll be a bonus for all of us. But as soon as you drop taxes in one area, or you remove some of this lift in property taxes, someone else is going to pay the bill. Guaranteed. Someone else is going to pay the bill. So the tax rate's going to go up, or the general assessment rate will soak up the rest of the money. So you could be talking a substantial amount of money when you go through this process, and it's a difficult situation to say to someone, you know, you're going to have to put 20% more in your tax bill or 10% more in your tax bill this year. When on a fixed income or a working family that has kids in school, that basically their income stays almost stable over the time, and you get faced with a 10 or 20% increase in your property taxes, it's a serious problem. And add that to the cost of insurance costs going up all across the board, and all the gasoline costs that you have to travel, home heating fuel, and all those things put together, all of a sudden the burden gets more and more and more difficult for people to handle. So every time that the taxes go up, I really think the solution to this whole thing would be for the municipality to keep reducing the tax rate substantial amounts, but still be able to do, instead of taking the lift, they take half the lift every year to put new services in place, and half of the rest of it for other things that the municipality is going to do. They could drop that lift in half and reduce the tax rate. Very, very simple for them to do. They've done it in the past, but it appears they have no appetite for that anymore. But saying those few things, we'll support the bill. If it does give a reduction to somebody, that will help somebody, I think we should go at a further day and have a further discussion on how we can get a fair taxation. And I believe this place should have a bill passed here that says you only pay property tax for service you receive. If you do not receive them, you do not pay the property tax. Thank you.
Recognize the Honourable Minister of Service, Nova Scotia, Municipal Relations. We'll close debate on Bill number 180. The Honourable Minister.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A few brief comments in closing debate. As members would know, I've indicated publicly in the past that our government intends to bring forward amendments to regulations for Bill number 40 that would resolve issues around condominiums and other prescribed types of dwellings, Mr. Speaker. As well, I want to point out for members of the House that over 30,000 Nova Scotia families benefited directly from Bill number 40, a bill that we believe has been effective. In addition to that, I'd like to say that in regards to the comments made by the member from Timberley Prospect, that any municipality that brings forward a request for similar amendments to this legislation or other legislation, we'd be more than happy to consider that, Mr. Speaker. We believe that municipalities have the authority and the jurisdiction to set rates and to establish the amount of money that taxation should be, amount of taxation that should be levied in each individual home. We know that the assessment of properties has been an ongoing issue for many, many Nova Scotians. We have made a number of attempts to resolve the issues around fairness. As I've indicated, over 30,000 Nova Scotia families have directly benefited with lower municipal taxes as a result of Bill 40. This gives HRM residents an opportunity to benefit as well that otherwise they wouldn't have had. And as I've indicated earlier, we'd be more than happy to look at other requests from other municipalities if they bring them forward. Thank you. I move closure of second reading.
Motion is for second reading of Bill 180. Is the House ready for the question? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried.
Bill number 180, an act to amend Chapter 18 of the Acts of 1998, the Municipal Government Act.
Order that Bill 180 be referred to the Committee on Law Amendments. The Honourable Government House Leader.
All kinds of good figures there. Mr. Speaker, would you please call Bill number 180, the municipal, I say again, would you please call Bill number 177, the Financial Measures Act 2005.
Bill number 177, the Honourable Minister of Finance.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I'm pleased to move second reading and have an opportunity to speak to this bill tonight. The Financial Measures Act enables changes to 6 acts of the Nova Scotia Legislature. These changes were included in the 05-06 budget, which we had the opportunity to present last Tuesday. Passage of these acts implements the government's fiscal plan for 05-06 and specifically reaffirms our commitment to deal realistically and practically with the province's debt. Mr. Speaker, it's worth noting that the government has introduced a budget with estimated $63.1 million surplus for 05-06. $57.1 million of the surplus relates to the expected receipt by the province this year of the portion of the $830 million of the offshore transfer. Our government has committed to using these funds to pay down the debt. Bill 177 creates a new public debt management fund that consolidates separate funds used previously to manage and retire the province's debt. The requirement to pay any extraordinary revenue in these accounts is continued. The province will be committed legally to balance its budget without relying on the year's portion of the $830 million related to the offshore agreement brought into revenue this year. The province will be required to maintain that balance throughout the year. As and when we reduce the debt, annual interest charges will be lowered, making the province more attractive to financial markets and providing us with greater flexibility to respond to the issues facing Nova Scotians. In addition to the issues arising from the offshore agreement, the Financial Measures Act touches on some of the key priorities of our budget this year, ranging from healthy children to promoting sound fiscal management with an updated financial management plan. We continue this year to follow through with the commitments we made to Nova Scotians. Mr. Speaker, the equity tax credit continues to help communities each year. It provides flexibility by allowing eligible corporations to obtain equity financing rather than going into debt. Hundreds of companies from Yarmouth to Sydney have benefited from the equity tax credit as it allows them to attain equity financing that was otherwise unavailable. In addition to housekeeping amendments, we are seeking to improve the pace which investments are made by labor-sponsored venture capital corporations in this province. Mr. Speaker, strengthening the minister's power to require these corporations to meet these obligations mean that the investments promised to Nova Scotia will take place and the expected benefits to our companies from these tax credits will be realized. We work with the Canadian Revenue Agency each year to ensure the taxation rules are clear and concise and consistent as possible, making life easier for taxpayers, no matter where they live. As a result, again this year, Bill 177 includes amendment to the request of Canadian Revenue Agency. New this year, Mr. Speaker, is a new tax credit to promote healthy living and participation by our youth in recreation and sporting activities. Improving the health of Nova Scotia's children is a responsibility shared by parents, communities, government, and schools. This year, the province of Nova Scotia is doing its part by investing in an initiative aimed at helping kids get in shape and stay in shape. We are building on government commitments as we set out in the blueprint for building a better Nova Scotia to increase the small business limit under which the small business tax rate applies. This year, the small business threshold is increased for corporate taxes from $300,000 to $350,000 for tax year ending March 31st, 2005, and from $350,000 to $400,000 for the tax year ending March 31st, 2006 and beyond. Mr. Speaker, this measure is a step towards making Nova Scotia economy more competitive, because a more competitive economy is the only way to guarantee that the required programs and services are available to our families today and tomorrow. This province's film industry has generated more than $100 million of production activity in each of the last 6 years and consistently employs about 2,000 Nova Scotians. Our government recognizes the film industry's contribution to the economy, and that is why we are extending the film tax credit by 10 years to 2016. Effective January the 1st, 2005, the tax credit rate increased to 35% for productions in HRM and 40% for productions outside HRM, with an additional 5% available for third and subsequent productions in any 2-year period. We are also taking another positive step towards encouraging business to invest in Nova Scotia by decreasing the large corporation tax credit on capital from 0.3% to 0.2% for a 4-year period starting July 1st, 2005. This tax applies to 1,400 of Nova Scotia corporations. A fair and effective tax system is only as good as our ability to enforce it. Mr. Speaker, Bill 77 includes provisions to ensure that there is consistency with the Canadian Revenue Agency and the Federal Income Tax Act. The bill strengthens and enforces provisions to the Provincial Income Tax Act through the inclusion of generally avoidance measures. Also, Mr. Speaker, Bill 177 contains provision touching on issues related to agricultural society year ends, grants in lieu of taxes for supported institution, residents, and tobacco tear tape. These changes come about, Mr. Speaker, in a budget that is balanced, the fourth balanced budget this government has brought into the House in as many years. The details of the measures I have spoken about this evening may not fascinate every citizen, but Nova Scotians can take comfort in knowing that our province's fiscal situation continues to improve and that our government is committed to a debt reduction plan that will see a better future for our children and generations to follow. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognized the honourable member for Halifax Fairview.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. I'm pleased to rise today as the opposition finance critic to address the Financial Measures Act, which is the other important piece of the government's budget. As the minister has stated, what it does is simply legislates all the changes to the existing laws that are made necessary by this year's budget. Mr. Speaker, we are very pleased about one thing in this Financial Measures Act, and that is for the first time in a number of years, the government hasn't used this bill as an omnibus bill to throw in everything that they could think of, Mr. Speaker. Now, we only have to go back to last year, for example, Mr. Speaker. We only have to go back to last year to remember that the government threw in at least a couple of completely gratuitous provisions that had no connection whatsoever to the budget, that they knew would be controversial. And if I may use such a word, Mr. Speaker, the government tried to sneak through the House by putting them into the Financial Measures Act. So, Mr. Speaker, we are pleased to see that this year's Financial Measures Act is at the very least confined to measures that were discussed in the minister's budget. The government learns its lessons slowly, Mr. Speaker, but it does eventually learn its lessons. Now, Mr. Speaker, there are many provisions in this bill which are highly technical. Many are suggested by the Canada Revenue Agency in order to harmonize federal and provincial income tax law, and so it's certainly not my intention to deal with every one. Mr. Speaker, you'll be aware, of course, that one of the difficulties in dealing with a bill such as this on second reading is the debate on second reading is supposed to be on the bill's principle, but in a bill like this, which contains quite literally dozens of sections amending, I think the minister said, at least 5 different laws, there's no particular connection between all the different clauses. There's no principle, as it were, that runs through the bill. So I hope, Mr. Speaker, you'll forgive me if I come a little closer than we normally do in second reading to referring to particular sections of the bill. Okay, what I'd like to do is highlight the provisions of the Financial Measures Act that are more than routine, that are more than technical, and Mr. Speaker, there are only 6. First of all, Mr. Speaker, this bill implements a tax credit for children's sport and recreation costs. The government has hit upon the happy name of the Healthy Child Tax Credit in order to describe this credit that is being made available to Nova Scotians. Now, Mr. Speaker, who can argue with a Healthy Child Tax Credit? It's a good thing, but there's a couple of problems that I would be remiss if I didn't point out about this so-called Healthy Child Tax Credit. The first one, of course, is that it is so very meager. The only thing the government could do that would be less would be to do nothing, because the tax credit is going to average, for each family that qualifies, it's going to average $15. Now, $15, Mr. Speaker, is not going to affect the behavior, in my opinion, of very many Nova Scotia families. The families that already have their children in sport and recreation programs are going to continue to do that, and they'll get there up to $15. The families that don't do it are not going to be impelled to do it by the offer of an extra $15 off their taxes, Mr. Speaker, especially if you have programs like hockey or anything that costs a substantial amount of money for equipment. Even soccer has an equipment cost, Mr. Speaker. One of the reasons it's so very popular, and I'm pleased to say that it's the sport that I played most in my youth. Even soccer has an equipment cost, Mr. Speaker, over and above the registration fees.
I heard you were a great official. Oh, I bet he was.
Mr. Speaker, so that's the first problem with the so-called Healthy Child Tax Credit, and that is it is so very, very small. It's one example of how throughout the budget the government has taken very, very small steps, almost as if they want to be able to say, look, we're doing something, even if it's not very much. But there's a bigger problem with the Healthy Child Tax Credit, Mr. Speaker, and I'll say this about healthy children. If this government wants healthy children, really, really wants healthy children, then I'll tell them on behalf of our caucus what they need to attack. What is the biggest threat to Nova Scotia children today? It's not, Mr. Speaker, sitting around doing nothing, not being active enough. It's not smoking, it's not drinking, it's not gambling. The biggest threat to our children is poverty. If you want to have a healthy child, then let's do something about the poverty in which far too many Nova Scotia children live, Mr. Speaker. That is the way to achieve healthy children in Nova Scotia. And I've said it before and I'll say it again, this government does not have a poverty agenda. I don't believe this government knows what a poverty agenda looks like. Mr. Speaker, this government is doing nothing or next to nothing about providing adequate support and income for Nova Scotia families who are in need of assistance. And I will say, Mr. Speaker, for my constituency alone, there are far too many children living in poverty. Living in poverty. Mr. Speaker, there's no nice way to describe it. I would love to be able to take some of the ministers over there, Mr. Speaker, and take them to the parts of my community that are simply poor. But then I doubt that they would necessarily want to do that, because in every one of their communities there are children who are poor. And here's the great irony of this healthy child tax credit, so-called, Mr. Speaker, is that those poor families don't qualify for it. Mr. Speaker, the children who are most in need of this government's help, and they offer a very small healthy child tax credit, but it's not available to poor people. Because in order to take advantage of this tax credit, you have to be earning enough money to pay provincial tax. And as we went through with the $155 checks that this government handed out before the last election, you only qualify for this if you earn enough money to pay tax. And there are literally hundreds of thousands of Nova Scotians who do not earn enough money to pay any Nova Scotia tax. This healthy child tax credit is a non-refundable credit. Mr. Speaker, I checked that out with the Department of Finance, and they have confirmed for me that it is a non-refundable credit, which means that poor people, the people whose children most need the support of their government, are out of luck again. And Mr. Speaker, the second thing that this bill does is deal with corporate taxes. Contrast what the government is doing on corporate taxes with what they are doing on child poverty. Contrast what they're doing with the personal allowance in residential care facilities, Mr. Speaker. $10 increase, Mr. Speaker. And a very meager increase in social assistance rates, which for the second year in a row won't even match inflation, so that the real income of people most in need of the help is actually falling. Contrast that with what's being done for our largest corporations. This is a budget, and this is a Financial Measures Act that offers no help to people, but offers help to the largest corporations, some of which are enormously profitable already. Thank you very much. Now, the government's doing two things, one of which we can support and one of which we have a harder time with. The first thing, Mr. Speaker, is that there's an increase in the exemption level for the small business threshold. We certainly support that. The government could be doing a lot more for small business. Support for small business is one of those things that everybody talks about, but so very little is actually done about. So this is a very small step to help Nova Scotia small business, which, as we all know and gets repeated in this House over and over again, they're the real drivers of the economy. They're the real drivers, especially of employment. Because those small businesses, they're not going anywhere. They're not about to pack up and leave when the government subsidies run out, because Nova Scotia is their home. It's where they want to be. It's where they're from. It's where they're going to stay. And any help they can get is most welcome. So we can definitely support that. But in one of those many ironies, one of those almost Kafkaesque ironies of government, the small business deduction is also available to large businesses. So the largest Nova Scotia businesses get the same break as the small businesses. Even though they're not small businesses, they get a small business deduction. Now, it's only in the world of government that you could have this situation where every business, no matter how large, gets advantage of a deduction called the small business deduction. How much is that going to cost us? Offering it not just to truly small businesses, but to every business? We don't know because the figure is not in the budget documents. Then there is, over and above this, the decrease in the large corporation tax rate, something that this government didn't promise in the last election, Mr. Speaker. When they raised the rate last year, they didn't say that they were going to reduce it the following year. So this is an unpromised bone being thrown to large corporations, which the government justifies by saying, well, it creates jobs. But of course they can't prove that. It's just an article of conservative ideology. Give money to companies is good. It doesn't matter that this government can produce not one iota of evidence that this is going to create one single job in Nova Scotia. When they engaged in the $155 taxpayer refund program before the last election, the Department of Finance documents, which we obtained after the election, showed that not even the government had any information about what impact this would have on the Nova Scotia economy. At the very best, you could say that the government didn't know. At the very worst, the government's own data showed that it would have a negligible impact on the economy because all it did was shift spending from one place to another place. That's all it did. So instead of, and they would trumpet the fact that with this $155, retail spending would go up. Well, of course it would, because you're putting it in the hands of consumers. So of course retail spending is going to go up. But then spending in other sectors of the economy goes down. For every $155 that's spent in the retail sector, there was $155 less to spend on roads, on schools, on paying public servants, all those things that government does. So all it did was shift the money around, and the government's own analysis showed that it was such a small amount, they couldn't even track its impact on the economy. And that's even more true of this large corporation tax deduction, which despite its size, $53 million over 4 years, it can't be tracked. The government has no idea where this money is going. And as I said in the debate on the budget itself, Mr. Speaker, since ING, Nova Scotia's largest and one of the most profitable auto insurers, gets the benefit of this large corporation tax rate, what do you think is going to happen to the money? It's going to disappear out of the province, Mr. Speaker, like the rest of ING's profits. It's not going to create one single job, and the government knows that, but it doesn't stop them from standing up and claiming the opposite. What do you do with that, Mr. Speaker? What do you do when you have a government that has ministers that are prepared to stand up and say things that aren't true? Like the minister responsible for the Insurance Act standing up the other day and saying public auto insurance doesn't work. Mr. Speaker, it works. It works great. It's been working for 30 years, Mr. Speaker. I grew up in Manitoba. The first insurance I ever had was under Manitoba public auto insurance. Mr. Speaker, guess what? It works fine. And it's a heck of a lot cheaper than the insurance that's available in Nova Scotia. And the only organization that doesn't agree with that is the right-wing propaganda machine, the Fraser Institute, Mr. Speaker. And so that's the study that our minister stands up and cites over and over again, even though nobody outside the Fraser Institute believes it's true. Mr. Speaker, what are you going to do with a government that stands up and says this large corporation tax cut is going to create jobs? Because clearly it's not true. Because even if it were true, they would have to acknowledge that when they raised it last year, it killed jobs. And am I seeing the government ministers agreeing with that? I mean, I'm seeing government ministers nod their heads over there and say, yeah, they acknowledge now that raising it last year killed jobs. So if we're going to lower it by the same amount over 4 years, that means gradually over the next 4 years, we're going to get the same jobs back that they killed all at once last year. But of course, you know they're not going to say that, Mr. Speaker, because they... Mr. Speaker, because you know they're not going to stand up there and acknowledge that. They're just going to stand up with their conservative ideology and say, yep, hand money to corporations, that's got to be good, right? Absolutely. Whether they can prove it or not. The third thing this bill does, Mr. Speaker, is it improves and enriches the film industry tax credit. I won't spend a lot of time on this since it's clear that all three parties in the House support that. We certainly called for that. I know the Liberal Party called for that. And I know the government eventually came on side. It's a good thing for our film industry. I mean, we have to ask ourselves the question, how far do we go with this? Every year for the number of years, the film industry tax credit has gone up, and as soon as we get to a certain level, we get outbid by competing provinces. How far can we go down this road? I don't think that question has properly been answered. Clearly, we can't continue to enrich the film industry tax credit every year. There comes a point when essentially our government would be propping up the film industry, Mr. Speaker. This is a government who said that they're not into propping up any private industry, Mr. Speaker. There comes a point, which it appears we haven't reached yet, but we will someday, when we've just gone too far, and even if we get undercut by another province, we won't be able to go any further. It would be interesting to know where the government thinks that point is. But at the very least, we can support this provision in the Financial Measures Act. And there's something else that's interesting, Mr. Speaker. The government is finally implementing something that's been in federal tax law for a very long time, something mysterious and complicated called general anti-avoidance rules. Now, these have been around for a long time. I remember when I was in law school, those many years ago, Mr. Speaker. You know, it's getting to be almost 20 years since I was in law school. That's hard to believe. But we were studying, even back then, Mr. Speaker, when I had a full head of wavy hair. Yeah, right. We were studying general anti-avoidance rules even back then. 30 years ago. And when the government of Nova Scotia decoupled its income tax system, gosh, it's got to be 4 years ago now, it's hard to believe that they didn't include this before now. But there they are. And what it is just a general rule. You know, forget all the super technicalities of income tax law. If a transaction is designed to avoid tax, if its essential purpose is to avoid paying tax, then it can, in principle, be disallowed. Now, this brings us into harmony with federal rules. That's the reason that we're doing it now. But what it does, Mr. Speaker, also is it underlines a very fundamental point about tax law, is that our whole system is premised on the idea every Nova Scotian, or as many as possible, have to believe that the tax system is fair. They have to believe, if they're going to be expected to pay their fair share every year, they have to know that other people are paying their fair share too. Because once Nova Scotians stop believing that, Mr. Speaker, it's a slippery slope to chaos. We see this around the world in new democracies, in developing countries, is when people stop paying their taxes, people say, oh, it's not fair, I'm not going to pay my taxes either, and then you have chaos. And the only way we keep the system going, well, two things keep the system going. One is that people believe the system is fair, and the other one, of course, is the heavy hammer of the Canada Revenue Agency, is people have to believe that if they cheat on their taxes, they will eventually be caught and punished. Now, what the government has never done is actually try to persuade Nova Scotians that the existing tax system is fair. It's something that my party has promised through the last couple of elections. I remember a past Liberal premier mocking that promise, Mr. Speaker. Of course, he and his party ended up in third place in the ensuing election, although I wouldn't say it was because of that. But I think that particular premier just chose the wrong things to mock. But one of the promises that we've made now, Mr. Speaker, is that the tax system in Nova Scotia has to be re-examined because we've gone far too long without a proper examination of whether the tax system is fair. Is everybody paying their fair share? Now, it's interesting that in the budget presented by the minister and in the Financial Measures Act, there's no discussion of this except for the general anti-avoidance rule. But mysteriously, Mr. Speaker, the promise, the commitment to review the tax system is found in the Department of Finance's business plan for 2005-2006, a document that is not tabled with the budget, to which the minister made no reference in his budget address. But according to the Department of Finance business plan, there will be, in this fiscal year, a comprehensive review of the Nova Scotia tax system, to which I say that's great. It does take this government, a long time to catch up with the ideas that we offer, an idea that we've been offering now for at least 6 years, and I'm glad to see that they're finally catching on. But what we need are the details. When? By who? What are their terms of reference? If you're promising us a tax review, what can we expect? We agree that that's important, but we need more details, and we need them soon. Mr. Speaker, a fifth thing that this act accomplishes is it makes a change to the Municipal Grants Act. The thorny question of the taxation of university residences, which is important for my municipality, the Halifax Regional Municipality, which is the home to so many fine post-secondary institutions and post-secondary residences. But it's also important to places like the Cape Breton Regional Municipality, Wolfville, Antigonish, the home of the Université Sainte-Anne, any place with a university residence. This is an important matter because they don't get the full value of property taxation for these university residences. The Union of Nova Scotia Municipalities has asked for 100% grants in lieu. The current rate is 40%. This bill puts it up to 50%. Certainly that's something we can support. It is a thorny question, and it is difficult to see how, in the long run, it is possible for this legislature to avoid moving it up to 100%. We're not saying that has to happen in 1 year. We recognize that it's a difficult question, but it's hard to see why municipalities should have to put up with 40% or 50% of the value of the property on which those university residences happen to sit. Mr. Speaker, the final thing that I want to talk about in this Financial Measures Act, that is the items that are more than merely technical, is the government's debt management plan. Well, it's good the government has a debt management plan. What they've done is they've tossed out last year's debt management plan. They've abandoned that one, which was released with such fanfare and then amended with a little less fanfare, and now they've completely tossed it out. Now they have a new debt management plan because they're expecting a great deal more money from Ottawa. Now, Mr. Speaker, I've said many times before, and I said it in my address in reply to the budget, that if there is one thing that just makes me angry about government in Nova Scotia, it is this 1,000-pound millstone that past governments have left around our necks. This incredible growing debt, $12.3 billion. Mr. Speaker, $12.3 billion, which sucks up $900 million a year in interest alone. Just imagine if we had a debt that took interest payments of half that amount. Because, of course, we can all agree that some debt is good, just like Nova Scotians know that if you have a debt for a house, that can be good. If you have debt for a car, that can be good. Mr. Speaker, some debt is good if you have an offsetting asset. Everybody knows that, and it's no different for the government. But we have about $2 billion of assets to show for that debt. And it doesn't take a mathematical genius to see that we have about $10 billion of debt and nothing to show for it. Imagine if that $900 million a year was $500 million or $400 million. The government's room for discretionary spending is so small. There's so much that just has to be laid out every year that what we end up fighting over in this legislature, Mr. Speaker, are remarkably small sums of money. Because so very much is committed just to keep a basic system running. $900 million in debt, almost $2.6 billion for health care, $1.2 billion, or 1.3 I think it is now, for education, over $700 million for community services, and that's just to keep the wheels turning. It leaves a remarkably small amount of money that is in any sense discretionary. Just imagine if the interest in our debt was half of what it was today. There would be so much more that we could do to tackle the poverty agenda. So much more that we could do to deal with roads, for that matter, or promoting excellence in education, both for our children in the P-12 system and in the post-secondary institutions of which we're so proud. Just think how much we can do, but we can't because of this 1,000-pound millstone around our necks. And as a result of this government's debt management plan, we can take about 20 pounds off that millstone. Mr. Speaker, we're not going to notice an awful lot of difference. This is perhaps what is most discouraging about the offshore accord, Mr. Speaker, and that is that despite what appears to be a very large sum of money, it's actually going to make a really small dent in that debt. And it just makes me so angry about what past governments have done. It's not this government's fault, Mr. Speaker. It's not even, much as I like to talk about the Liberals, much as I like to point out the weaknesses of the Liberal Party, Mr. Speaker, it's not even, strictly speaking, their fault. Mr. Speaker, let's be clear about who ran up this debt. It wasn't the Reagan Liberal government, Mr. Speaker. They passed along a fairly modest debt. It was that... Sorry, I have to not use unparliamentary language, Mr. Speaker. It was that Buchanan government. From 1978 to 1990, and then the Cameron government that followed them, just spent money like drunken sailors, Mr. Speaker. They didn't look past their own noses, and they ran up this enormous debt with nothing to show for it. And then when the Liberals came in, Mr. Speaker, let's be frank, they inherited one heck of a mess, Mr. Speaker. They didn't even have a straight set of financial books to deal with, Mr. Speaker. They had to spend their first year or more in office just figuring out how bad the situation was that had been bequeathed to them by the previous Conservative government. And they tried, after their fashion, to do something about it, Mr. Speaker. But by the time their term was over, 1997, 98, 99, they were just tired, and they had completely given up on any attempt to deal with the debt. And so they inherited a substantial debt and a province in financial disarray. Let's never understate what they inherited, Mr. Speaker. But at the end of their term, their 6 years in office, they too had added an extra $3 billion to the debt. And in the 1999 budget, the one that ultimately was defeated, Mr. Speaker, they were proposing to borrow another $600 million off book debt, and they said that would save the healthcare system. Well, and then this government, despite its best intentions, has run up the debt even further. Now, again, since I'm in the spirit of fairness, one of the main reasons why this government has run up the debt is because they finally published an honest set of books, Mr. Speaker, and they took on all the debt, NSRL, Sydney Steel, all the things that had been left off in a filing cabinet somewhere, and the government would pretend it didn't count. But of course it did count, because the people of Nova Scotia owed the money. Now, having said that, Mr. Speaker, they have run up a modest debt of their own, but whatever happened, whoever's fault it is, and I know I dwell on this, but this is the thing about Nova Scotia politics that just makes me so angry, is whoever's fault it was, we have this debt. And it leaves us so little room to deal with the real issues confronting Nova Scotians today. So this government's debt management plan, which is embodied in the Financial Measures Act, is such a modest attempt to deal with the debt. Now, having said that, we agree with it. We support it. We think that the rate and the rhythm at which this government proposes to pay down the debt is the appropriate one. The Liberals say it should be paid down faster, but then they skate around the issue of, okay, what services would they cut in order to pay it down faster, or what taxes would they raise? They completely refuse to deal with that question. And you can't have it both ways. You can't say that the debt should be run down faster and then refuse to say how you would do it. So we agree with the government, but at the same time, we have to acknowledge what a tiny tiny dent this government's debt management plan is going to make in that debt that after all these years still hangs around our neck. So what is our caucus's attitude to the Financial Measures Act? It matters on this bill more than on most, Mr. Speaker, because this bill, unlike almost any other, is a matter of confidence in the government. It is an integral part of the government's budget. If this bill is defeated, the government falls. And so we have to approach it with the appropriate measure of seriousness, the appropriate measure of weighing all of the factors, Mr. Speaker, because it is no small thing to defeat a government. As we are learning with all the turmoil in Ottawa, I still haven't come across anybody in my constituency who thinks this is the right time for a federal election. But it appears that the federal Conservatives know differently. For some reason, in their ridings, people appear to be telling them something different than anything I've heard. But anyway, it's no small thing to have a provincial election over a budget. It's no small thing to have a provincial election at the same time as a very probable federal election. At a time when the federal government is in turmoil, there's a certain amount to be said for some stability on the provincial scene. Well, our reaction to the Financial Measures Act is the same as it is to the budget, of course. If we're going to vote against the Financial Measures Act, we're going to vote against the budget. If we're going to vote against the budget, we're going to vote against the Financial Measures Act. It's not like we're going to support one. It's not like we're going to support one and oppose the other. Our attitude towards this bill is the same as it was to the budget. We are pleased at some of the measures. We're pleased, Mr. Speaker, at the Healthy Child Tax Credit, but it is so very little in the face of such very great need. We are wary of this government because more than once, Mr. Speaker, what they do falls so far short of what they say. And some of the promises in the budget and in the Financial Measures Act, in fairness, we need time to see whether they can actually follow through in what they say they're going to do, particularly on this issue of waiting times. We're disappointed, Mr. Speaker, at some of the choices the government has made at the time when the Financial Measures Act contains no real break for people. There's no break on the HST on family essentials, Mr. Speaker. There is nothing in the budget or the Financial Measures Act where I can point to it and say to the people in my constituency, look, this is what you get if this budget passes. This thing here, this is good for you and your family. This is going to make a real difference to you and your family. At most, it's a few dollars here, a few dollars there. They are not going to notice any difference in their day-to-day lives if we pass this Financial Measures Act. And we are disappointed that, Mr. Speaker, to the extent that the government had some discretionary spending, they chose to give it to large, profitable corporations like ING instead of to the people, Mr. Speaker. That is not a choice this caucus would have made. We are very disappointed that that is a choice that they made. And so ultimately, Mr. Speaker, we are surprised at how difficult our decision is going to be. We were hoping, expecting it was going to be easier. We were hoping and expecting that we would see something like last year's budget, a real win for the people of Nova Scotia. What this government did on long-term care, Mr. Speaker, was a good thing last year. It was the right thing to do. Unfortunately, the implementation has proven to be more problematic than it should have been, Mr. Speaker, and we are very disappointed to find out that the good in that initiative has been tarnished by some of this government's choices over exactly how to implement it. So we are surprised at how difficult our choice ultimately is. We will, as part of the budget, be considering very carefully this Financial Measures Act. We have been, and we will be, up until the vote comes on the estimates and on this Financial Measures Act, we will be consulting with the people in our constituencies and beyond. What is it that they want? Does this government deserve to survive through another budget cycle? Or is it time that the choice was put to the people about the choices that this government has made versus the choices that this caucus would make on behalf of the people that we represent. Mr. Speaker, it remains to be seen. Thank you very much.
Honourable member for Cape Breton South.
Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker. And Mr. Speaker, it's a pleasure to join in the debate this evening on the Financial Measures Act. And I might say it's a hard act to follow the profound musings of the member from Halifax Fairview, scintillating to say the least. Everyone on the edge of their seats for that address, I'm sure. Riveting. But anyway, yeah, riveting. But it is a pleasure to speak this evening for a few moments on Bill 177. And this bill is important to government. It's an enabling bill to the budget, and it's also a companion bill. And short, Mr. Speaker, it's a money bill. And it's one of the few acts that could be called that would result in the defeat of the government if it does not receive a majority of votes. And in this particular House with a minority government, that's always a possibility. I speak from experience, Mr. Speaker, when the government, when I was House Leader sitting in that chair over there with a government of 19 members and a House of 52, and was being prodded every day of the week to call the Financial Measures Act, and steadfastly refused because I knew that the guillotine was going to drop the minute I did. And so somehow the government went on for a while without this money bill being passed in the House, but at the appropriate time the government, with the help, or the current government with the help of the NDP, put an end to our government anyway, and the Financial Measures Act was still on the order paper. So yeah, that's right, yeah. The only thing good about it was that the NDP didn't take over. But anyway, Mr. Speaker, because Mr. Speaker, as bad as this government has dealt with the finances of this province in terms of the long-term debt, I shudder to think where that long-term debt would be today if the NDP were governing this province. Probably twice as much, because all they know, Mr. Speaker, is tax and spend. And that's been proven right across this land, time and time again. The most interesting part of this bill, Mr. Speaker, is the debt management fund and the commitment to ensure that the $830 million can't be used to balance the budget. In other words, the budget must be balanced without the offshore fund. While the intention is noble, that is not what government is doing, Mr. Speaker. The reality is that $830 million is a key part of the budget. Without the offshore money, the surplus would be a razor-thin $6 million. If that's the case, Mr. Speaker, then why is the government claiming this budget has a $63 million surplus? If this bill becomes law, Mr. Speaker, then government must change that part of the budget. It's simply smoke and mirrors. Mr. Speaker, the debt reduction plan is a sham. It will take until 2009 before the debt goes back to the levels of today. Mr. Speaker, how can that be? How can the government say it's putting the $830 million on the debt, but the debt will still grow by $90 million this year? So here's what we have, Mr. Speaker. Government claims a $63 million surplus. The debt is going up by $90 million, and supposedly the offshore money is going to the debt. Mr. Speaker, I would like the government to explain that to Nova Scotians. How can the Premier say that the $830 million is going to the debt, but the debt keeps going up?
Good question.
I think the government should do an advertising campaign to explain that one to the people of Nova Scotia, because I certainly haven't been able to figure it out. Mr. Speaker, after all is said and done, this government is still borrowing $340 million. So my question, Mr. Speaker, to the government, when is this going to stop?
Good question.
The Premier promised, Mr. Speaker, that in 1999 and again in 2001 that the debt would stop growing. In fact, Mr. Speaker, let's look at what the Premier has said about the debt, and we'll let Nova Scotians decide whether or not those statements were truthful. On April 17, 2001, the Premier told this legislature, and I quote, Mr. Speaker, what I will confirm is that a year from now, this government will introduce a balanced budget, and from that day onward, the debt of this province will no longer grow, close quote. So, Mr. Speaker, did the Premier break his promise? Sounds like a yes to me. That was his quote, not mine. On March 25, 2002, the Premier wrote in the Chronicle Herald, to be sure, there are some people who suggest that government should continue borrowing on the debt and spending beyond its means. I don't believe there is merit to this argument. Such an approach might feel good today. However, we need to ask ourselves, who pays for it tomorrow? Premier said that. Yes, Mr. Speaker, who pays for it tomorrow? This is the best opportunity in 30 years to stop adding to the debt and start paying it down. This Premier is losing that opportunity for a whole generation. It's funny that back in 1999, the Premier wouldn't support the budget because it added to the debt. He voted against the budget because it added to the debt. Well, Mr. Speaker, since the Premier came to office, the debt has grown by $2.5 billion. $2.5 billion is the entire health budget this year, $1 billion more than in 1999. If you don't believe me, Mr. Speaker, let's look at what the Premier told the Chronicle Herald on New Year's Eve, 2001. And I quote, on June 18, 1999, the Conservative caucus voted against the budget with a $600 million deficit. I told Nova Scotians that in good conscience I could not support more debt. Close quote. That was a direct quote from the Premier on New Year's Eve, 2001. So does the Premier now, in good conscience, add to the debt? The Premier does not have one iota of credibility on the debt management program. He broke this promise, and those are his statements that I've outlined to you, and he has clearly misled Nova Scotians on the provision of debt retirement versus debt increasing. Mr. Speaker, this bill does have some good clauses, including the tax credit for participation in recreation. Unfortunately, that only amounts to about $15 in tax savings per child. A good measure, but in many respects, it's a half measure. I was pleased to see the film tax credit increase, but again, it does not match that of Manitoba, and the incentives to film outside of Halifax are not adequate. Now, Mr. Speaker, this particular tax credit is a real sore spot with those of us who come from the other end of this province. Because when we were in government, Mr. Speaker, we set up a film, the sound stage in Point Edward in Cape Breton to develop the film industry. And Mr. Speaker, we did that with a purpose. It was a new industry for the area. We trained people to work in the film industry and the stage production industry in Cape Breton. And when we did, Mr. Speaker, we as a government wanted the tax credit to increase to 35% at the time and on to 40%, which at the time was catching up with Newfoundland. Pit Pony was a successful production in that sound stage in Cape Breton, and there were other possibilities of productions that were being done all over the island, or there were other productions, and there were possibilities of new productions in the sound stage in Point Edward. And what happened, Mr. Speaker? When this crowd came into office, they backed up the tax credit in Cape Breton, destroyed the film industry in Cape Breton, and now, lo and behold, once the film industry is no longer alive in Cape Breton, the sound stage is gone, so now a warehouse. The workers have all migrated to work in the film industry somewhere else. Guess what the government does? They reinstitute the tax credit after they've destroyed the industry in Cape Breton. So you have to wonder, what was on the government's mind when they could not have done the increases in the film tax credit when they took power, but had to wait until the soundstage was destroyed and all the workers who had been trained in the film industry had left. A great opportunity wasted by the government to promote an industry in Cape Breton, Mr. Speaker. The big disappointment in the budget, Mr. Speaker, is there are no tax measures to stimulate the rural economy that was promised in 1999, but like most other promises, it was broken. The bill, Mr. Speaker, highlights a series of disappointments rather than accomplishments. What we have is a government that has lost its way from what it promised back in 1999, a year full of promises, full of hope. What we have is 6 years of missed opportunity, 6 years of neglecting our education system, 6 years of increased fees and taxes, particularly user fees, 6 years of neglecting our roads, 6 years of watching our offshore industry deteriorate, and I'm going to say a few words about that in a moment, 6 years of no growth in the tourism sector, and 6 years of skyrocketing tuition. 6 years of rural depopulation, watching our small communities slowly die. Where is the investment in rural Nova Scotia that was promised. This budget tries to make up for 6 years of lost opportunity. Mr. Speaker, the question on the minds of all members is whether this government deserves our support. Our party understands the choices that government must make. The difference, however, Mr. Speaker, is our party had $1.8 billion less in revenues than the current government. And I want to talk about the offshore for a moment. The Sable project laid the foundation for growth throughout the first 6 years of this government. Where is the incentive to grow our offshore? The Sable project, Mr. Speaker, is the only project that is viable and was viable, created a lot of jobs in Nova Scotia, Mr. Speaker, a great deal of jobs, a great deal of activity here in Metro, with offices springing up all over the place, with people working in good jobs, and the excitement that Sable brought to the province. What has happened since, Mr. Speaker? The only thing happened was this government changed the name from the Petroleum Directorate to the Department of Energy. There hasn't been one project brought in by this government in the offshore industry since this government came to power. I don't know why we have a Minister of Energy and a whole floor full of people working over there in the same building that we're in when there's nothing going on in the energy sector. I'm going to drop down to their office one day and find out what they're all doing over there, because there's no activity in the offshore, nothing. I would love to be that's got to be the best job in Nova Scotia, to be the Minister of Energy. It's got to be the best job in Nova Scotia, to have a cabinet position to be the Minister of Energy, because he has absolutely nothing to do. Absolutely nothing. You're the veteran. Absolutely nothing. At least, that's right, because at least the member opposite says, I wanted to create the Ministry of Energy. I certainly did, because when I was Minister of Petroleum, of the Petroleum Directorate, we had Sable. And the reason this government is getting over $800 million from the federal government today is because of the Sable project. Not anything this crowd did, Mr. Speaker, to bring anything in the energy sector to Nova Scotia. All this money came as a result of the Sable project, the much maligned Sable project. Well, it was maligned by this crowd, but what have they done to bring, what projects has this government brought into Nova Scotia since they came to power? None. Absolutely none. Now, if anybody can stand on their feet and refute that, do so. This Minister of Transportation and Public Works and his government chased Semper Gas out of the province when they were wanting to run laterals throughout the province to distribute natural gas when it was viable to do it. They wouldn't make a decision for a whole year until Semper threw up their arms and said, I'm not going to do business in this backwater, and they left. Because this government had no plan for the offshore, still doesn't have a plan for the offshore, has a minister with a department of high-paid people over there doing absolutely nothing. Absolutely nothing. All the major oil companies have left. They've all left. You don't see them. All the offices are closed. There's nothing going on in the offshore. Yet we have the resources out there to make this province a have province, to make this province much more successful than even the Sable project did in the late 1990s. Without the Sable project, we wouldn't be debating the potential for $830 million in additional revenue. And I want to remind Nova Scotians again, and all members of this House, that it was the Liberal government that brought Sable project to Nova Scotia. It is the Conservative government that's benefiting from that project to the tune of $830 million coming from the federal Liberal government. So it all adds up to the provincial Liberal government, when it was in power, brought the project here. The federal Liberal government are giving this crowd the money to balance their books in Nova Scotia, and still the debt goes up. What has this government done? Nothing. You know, the House Leader the other day credits the Premier for good negotiating. Negotiating what? He negotiated a deal that was predicated on the fact that the previous Liberal government in this province bought Sable in this province, and the federal government lived up to its promise that was kept by the Martin government. But, you could stand here and argue. You could stand here and argue that Nova Scotia got a good deal or they didn't get a good deal on the royalty program. You can argue that till the cows come home. But what you can't argue is that this government and its current Minister of Energy and its current Energy Department has brought nothing to this province. Has brought nothing in the way of new development in the energy sector to Nova Scotia. You can't point to one solid thing that this government has done in regards to developing our offshore resources. Not one thing. And that is a terrible legacy that when this government leaves office soon, that they will leave behind. Absolutely nothing in the offshore. As I said, Mr. Speaker, if there was ever a job in Nova Scotia that was a job that would rival any other job, I guess, in terms of its I'm looking for a word here because I'm trying to get the correct word. Well, okay, what I will say is that this is the best job. Let me say this. This is the best. Now, you know, I will say this, Mr. Speaker, that the government House Leader works hard. There's no question about that, you know. What they should do is do away with the Ministry of Energy and put it under the House Leader. I mean, there wouldn't be any more strain on him because there's nothing going on in that department anyway. And he could handle it, so. The government has benefited. Now listen to this, Mr. Speaker. This Nova Scotian should really know what's going on here. You know, they talk about balancing the budget. There is $55 million in forfeited offshore leases. Go back to the government revenue. What does that mean? All these oil companies have left. They forfeited their leases. The money goes back into the provincial treasury, and the provincial treasury puts it on their books as a surplus. Now, you know, what a way to get a surplus. All the oil companies have left the province and turned in their leases and said, we no longer want to do business here. We can't do business with this crowd. They're strangling us in regulations. They're not offering any incentives. They don't want us here. So they all left. Just like Sempra left when the Minister of Transportation and Public Works put the run on them, because he wouldn't allow them to put laterals across the highways or the secondary roads in Nova Scotia. Held them up for a whole year. Every other place in the world was doing it but here. So Sempra left. Sempra left. Well, you know, I'd asked the minister to explain then why did Sempra leave? At some future point. Instead of growing the industry and moving it forward, this government is feeding on the decline. This government is feeding on the decline in the industry, Mr. Speaker. Not in the growth of the industry, but in the decline of the industry. And Nova Scotians have to know that. The reason they're $55 million richer is because these oil companies have left and turned in their leases, forfeited them, said, see you later, we don't want to do business in Nova Scotia. We'll go elsewhere with our major companies. I guess the question, Mr. Speaker, is can Nova Scotia stand another year of this kind of inaction? I don't think so. If this kind of thinking continues, this $830 million will be the last check this government gets from the offshore. And again, I remind Nova Scotians, this money is coming as a direct result of the Sable project, a project brought to Nova Scotia by the Savage and McClellan governments of the late 90s. This crowd had nothing to do with it. And I think Nova Scotians should know that, and they know that. They know that since they've come to power, there has been nothing done in the offshore, absolutely nothing, except certain members of the government like to attend offshore conferences and tell the world what they're doing, but I haven't seen any evidence of any rewards coming from those conferences or any deals that we're making in Nova Scotia. The big oil companies have given up on Nova Scotia, and this government knows it. What we don't have in this province, Mr. Speaker, is an industry. What we had was one project called Sable. That's it. There has been nothing happened since. And I say that's a shame. That's a shame that this government did not seize the opportunity to go after and chase and maintain the large oil companies, to encourage them with incentives to develop in the offshore here, to proceed with the many projects that we could have used to make Nova Scotia even a better place to live than it is now. What we need from this government, Mr. Speaker, is leadership. We need leadership to create an industry here, an oil and gas industry that we can all be proud of. It's been done in other places in the world. It's been done in Europe. It's been done in the States. It's been done out west. Why isn't it being done in Nova Scotia? Is it that this government doesn't care about the offshore, doesn't care about the rewards that can come from developing the offshore? You know, Mr. Speaker, there are many factors that we have to look at in this budget before we can decide to support this bill and, in fact, to support the budget. Mr. Speaker, I'm not going to take up too much more time of the House this evening, except because I would certainly like to defer to my friend, the House Leader of the official opposition, to wind up the debate this evening. But I do want to say, Mr. Speaker, that over the next few days, many of our members will have an opportunity to debate the Financial Measures Act, and at some point this act is going to come to a vote. It's going to come to a vote, and we haven't decided whether or not we're going to support the Financial Measures Act yet, because, again, there are a lot of things in the Financial Measures Act that this government has taken credit for that they don't deserve to take credit for, and they know that. And they know that, Mr. Speaker. But we're going to watch the debate over the next few weeks, and we're going to be very, we're willing to listen to what the government has to say as time moves on and what the official opposition has to say. And at the appropriate time, our party will make our decision as to whether or not we're going to support the Financial Measures Act and ultimately the budget. Thank you very much, Mr. Speaker.
Thank you. Recognize the honourable member for Cole Harbour Eastern Passage.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. I'll say a couple of words and then adjourn the debate for the evening, and then we can start up tomorrow. But I do want to say, Mr. Speaker, that this legislation, this Financial Measures Act, is really one part of the vision of this government for the coming year as to how they see the province being improved, how this government will achieve certain things. It is the legislative changes that go along with the money changes that we see in the budget that will be voted on in a couple of weeks, Mr. Speaker. And this is our first chance to debate the legislative changes that will come with that. And they are many, and they are significant changes. But at the same time, it's about talking about the juxtaposition, comparing, Mr. Speaker, the what they do provide in this Financial Measures Act and what they don't. And I'll give you a couple of quick examples this evening, Mr. Speaker. On the one hand, they give $4.5 million in tax cuts to large corporations. On the other hand, they give $15 to a child to help them register for a sport. Doesn't seem like much of a comparison. I mean, you know, $15, I have young children, and I register them in sports. My son played hockey in the winter and fall. He plays soccer. My daughter joins certain activities as well. Mr. Speaker, in those circumstances, I can tell you $15 goes nowhere. It's $300 for hockey. It's $105, if not $125 for soccer. Mr. Speaker, these are sports that are quite, and that's not even including the equipment. That's just registration. So, Mr. Speaker, these are quite expensive sports. $15 will do nothing. I would suggest to you that if we can provide $4.5 million in tax cuts to corporations, large corporations, I think we can provide more than $15 for every child who wants a chance to play a sport in this province, Mr. Speaker. And that is a classic example of where this Financial Measures Act and this government is laying its priorities. I'll give you another example. On the last full day of the election in 2003, the Premier, for some reason, showed up in my riding, went out to Ocean View Manor to make an announcement saying someone must have did the polling. Someone must have told him that the polls said that you better solidify some of that senior vote. You better get on TV the last night and promise them that allowance, the personal comfort allowance, I think it was like $105. And he promised it would go up. It would go up significantly. They would have a lot more money in their pocket. $10. That's what we get from this budget, a $10 increase in the... Do you actually say that with a straight face? I can't believe, Mr. Speaker, that the Minister of Transportation and Public Works is saying that was a 10% increase. My recollection was, I recall $150 being bandied about last year as an increase, 150, yeah, 200. I heard 200. The Premier was more than willing to show up in my riding. I remember this. I remember waving at the bus as it left. I was on my lunch break. and sort of laughing at him as he left. And I thought to myself, you're coming out here to make an announcement. I'm not sure why you picked my riding, but you came out here to make an announcement on the last day of the election, and as a result, Mr. Speaker, he made a promise to seniors in my riding and in a lot of other ridings that they were in nursing homes, and for families who had parents or relatives in nursing homes, that they would get a larger personal allowance, Mr. Speaker. And yet in this budget we get $10. Now, well, I'm not even going to say what the woman from Ocean View Manor said to what the Premier can do. But Mr. Speaker, I will say this, that $10 on one hand for seniors, and then on the other hand, we see bonuses equivalent to over $1 million for senior civil servants. Again, another example, and that's not even in this fiscal year, that's in last fiscal year, that's 2 fiscal years ago. So, Mr. Speaker, again, we see the comparison. $1.1 million in bonuses for senior civil servants and Crown Corporation executives and board members, and on the other hand, $10 for a senior to increase for what they do. I wouldn't consider that a choice that would be made. I wouldn't consider that something that Nova Scotians would say is adequate. Yet those are the choices we see this government making. And those are classic examples of comparing what this Tory government wants to do with the money. And I take with interest the point made by the House Leader for the Liberal Party when he said that in the past 6 years we've had increase in revenue of $1.8 billion. $1.8 billion, Mr. Speaker, more this year being spent than there was in 1999. And yet what do we have? $10 increases for seniors in nursing homes, $15 tax credit for children who want to play sports, $4.5 million in tax cuts for corporations, $1.1 million in bonuses for senior civil servants, Mr. Speaker. People want to know where their tax dollars are going. There is a good example of what this government is choosing to spend their tax money on, Mr. Speaker. And frankly, that is a serious problem with this Financial Measures Act. And frankly, it's a serious problem with this government. Their lack of vision, their lack of scope, their lack of desire to actually spell out to Nova Scotians how and where they'll spend the money in a way to make their lives better for Nova Scotians. Because frankly, that is what this is about. That's why we're elected, because people believe that as elected officials, we're going to do things to make their lives better. They elected a Tory government. They elected 25 members, Mr. Speaker, because those people in those ridings believed that that government would do something better for them. And yet, what do we see? $4.5 million in corporate tax cuts, $1.1 million in bonuses, and almost nothing for seniors and for children. And I want to give another example, a very good example, I think, because, you know, I have in my riding fishermen, Mr. Speaker. I have lobster fishermen, I have fishermen who fish herring, and I actually see the boats from my office. My office overlooks the creek, as we call it in Eastern Passage. There's about 30, 35 boats in that part of the harbor, in our harbor. And, those fishermen, they have licenses. Eventually they want to pass them on to their children. They want to be able to hand them over to them and know that they're going to be able to carry on in what is a good profession, a good career for community. The money can stay in the community. Good jobs that pay good money will stay in a community, not necessarily being taken over by corporate interests, because we all know what happened to the cod fishery when corporate interests get involved, Mr. Speaker. We all know what happened to a lot of other fisheries in this region when corporate interests got involved. There are still some good fisheries left in this province. Most of them shellfish, Mr. Speaker, and as a result, what we do know is that we slowly are seeing the corporatization and the corporate takeover of those licenses. And one very crucial way of stopping that would be provide a capital gains exemption for fishermen. You want to talk about tax cuts? Let's not talk about $4.5 million in tax cuts for corporations. Let's talk about tax cuts for hard-working fishermen and their families, so that when they retire, that $500,000 license can be sold without having to pay the tax on it. And maybe they'll sell it to their relatives. Maybe they'll sell it to someone else in the community. So, okay, I guess I'm going to have to spell this out, Mr. Speaker. A few years ago, we decoupled the tax system in this country and in this province. We have two tax acts. We have a federal tax act. We have a provincial tax act. And under the Provincial Tax Act, if this province wants to exempt capital gains for fishermen in this province for the Nova Scotia portion, they can do that. They do not need the federal government to approve that. They don't need the federal government to agree to that. Yet we've heard the Minister of Fisheries say in this very room last week that, well, we need to work this out with the federal government. No, they don't. That's a cop-out, Mr. Speaker. If they wanted to exempt on their portion of the tax, they could do it. They should have done it, and they could do it in this act, Mr. Speaker. And I would suggest to you that that is a tax cut that Nova Scotians in rural communities in this province would much appreciate. It would give an opportunity for the people, the fishermen in this province, to be able to sell their licenses and enjoy them in there, and so that those licenses and those benefits could stay in their communities, Mr. Speaker. These are all things that could have been done and should have been done in this legislation, should have been done in this budget, Mr. Speaker, but instead what we see are the choices made by this government, Mr. Speaker. And what I would say to you is those are choices that most Nova Scotians, if they actually had a chance to look at the in-depth in this Budget and Financial Measures Act the way we did, would actually be very shocked and surprised to see exactly the choices this government is making. I'll have more comments to make tomorrow, Mr. Speaker, but for today I'll move adjournment of debate.
Motion is to adjourn debate on Bill 177. Is agreed? Honourable Government House Leader on tomorrow's hours of business and order of business and hours.
Speaker, I move the House to now rise to meet again on the morrow at the hour of 12. The House will sit until 8 p.m. The order of business following the daily routine will be question period, Mr. Speaker, followed by supply for 4 hours, and then, Mr. Speaker, we'll go into public bills for second reading. We'll continue with the Financial Measures Act, and when we complete the Financial Measures Act, Mr. Speaker, we'll go on to public bills for third reading. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
Motion is the House adjourned to 12 noon tomorrow. Is it agreed? All those in favor say aye. Counterminded nay. Motion is carried. The House adjourned to 12 noon tomorrow.